Next session, what is the pharmaceutical industry doing to make trials more inclusive? With the lovely Bruno Jolain, Portfolio and Strategy Lead, Health Equity and Population Science from Roche. Thank you very much, Bruno.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be part of the presentators, and I want to say that I cannot present the whole pharma industry experience, nor even Roche, so I will speak on my own behalf with my experience of 30 years in the industry and the last 15 years with Roche. So I have a couple of disclaimers. I'm fully employed by Roche. I have stock with Roche. And I'm speaking again on my behalf, not on behalf of my company. I feel very lucky because I'm part of a small team within Roche, which is called Global Health Security and Population Science. We are only 6 people out of a company of 100,000 employees. But what we do is 100% dedicated to what we all want to achieve together. And our job is really to be connected to the organization because there are a huge number of people who are involved to make it successful. I'm going to try to give you a couple of hints of what we do concretely to move the needle in my company, and I know that many other big pharma companies are doing the same. As I mentioned this morning in one of my questions when I mentioned prioritization, I just want to caveat that what we do in global pharma companies is that we start with research in the lab, and then we move into development and clinical trials, and we have actually the opportunity and the duty to integrate this concept of diversity, patient representation, end to end. And some of it can start in the lab. What are the cells that we use to test our products in the lab for potential discovery of future innovations? It starts here. What do we do in early development? What do we do in full development? And again, we have the chance that we have development programs, not only one study, several studies, which is where we can also approach the diversity and inclusivity by saying in this part of the program, we try to answer that this seems to be the highest priority, and then we move to this one and so on. That's really a privilege that we have in the pharma industry. We all are familiar with the context of what has been the challenge of historically having a poor representation, having limited genomic data, primarily in population from European ancestries, and also having some preconceived ideas that some patients, they just don't want to participate. But actually, it's because they are not asked. If you actually go to them, they will be willing to participate. A very important aspect that also we account for in big pharmas is that eventually we want to make our products available to where we can bring them. So it's a global thinking and thinking about the global population aspects. And the population demographics, they are changing. The population today and in 20 or 30 years globally will be different. We have these dynamics that we need to account for. So we talk a little bit about the regulatory framework. I think that it's important that we account for it, but it's also something that is evolving. We've heard from the EMA there is no formal recommendation in Europe. We know that there is formal recommendation and actually a legal framework in the US with a law which has been voted with formal guidances, which even before the law was effective led to some regulatory decisions that if a given product was not enough representing the underlying population, there could be some post-approval requirement to complement this. But there are other parts in the world that have asked for actually years to have sufficient local data to understand if a given drug is actually what is the effect in their populations. That's the case in China, that's the case in Japan, that's the case in India. And this is not new. This is absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. What all these stakeholders have in common is that eventually the role of the regulators is to make sure that the products are approved and on the basis of data that represent the patients for whom the treatments are intended to be used. So that's something that is common. There are, of course, some that make more focus on some aspects. Fair enough. And we need eventually to bring some evidence on all of these aspects. But we cannot do everything at the same time. This aspect of prioritization and scientifically understanding which are the questions, the more important to prioritize initially, and then how can we build on that, is paramount to the way that we organize this and tackle this question in the pharma industry. So the problem statement, as we put it internally, was saying, okay, there are clearly some requests from regulatory agencies. We need to conduct our trials in a more representative manner. We have plenty of scientific data that tell us that why we have to do so. Still, we are not there yet. So what can we do to address and make it integrated practice in the way that we develop drugs? So what we've done is a couple of years already there has been a formal position of the company that has been developed and that has been made in the public domain. It helps us a lot. For us, a small group of 6 people who try to convince 100,000 people that they have to do differently from what they've done the last forever, that we have top management has publicly made this position saying that we are committed to changing. We are committed to advancing inclusive research. We are committed to eventually address the bias to clinical trials participation, to diversify the genetic data on which we do the early research, and so on. So that helps a lot, because I can tell you if we take a curve of the engagement behind inclusive research in the company, all employees, and it's not a nice ghost curve. You have a big peak on the left of people who are totally opposite. You know, they really see only risk and concern and so on. And you have a very nice peak of people who are super convinced and really behind that. The great thing is that our top management is here, so they can help all the big middle who are, honestly, they're learning, they're asking, they're raising a lot of questions. Will that increase the risk? Will that slow down our capacity? Will that eventually be of any value? So that's where we are today, but we have a formal company position that is extremely helpful. Now, what we did is that a bit the same mindset of the 4 steps that Sean described earlier, we actually formalized what we call the 5 Ps, or the 5 principles of what we should apply consistently in order to make this inclusive research a reality. And you will see some of the words are the same as the one that were used. I just want to say that this addresses the whole part of how do we design the trial, how do we implement the trial. We do not address the monitoring and the reporting, not that we don't consider that important, but if we don't design and implement the trials right now, it will take at least 5 years until we see any effect. So we focus really on that, making sure that we have very clear principles that help the different teams design the trial with an inclusive research in mind. So I will go a little bit more in detail in each of them and give examples, but it starts with the population. From a biological, genetic, demographic standpoint, what do we know? What is the distribution? How should we account for that? The next one is the geography. And here, geography, we really go into 3 aspects of where the patients are. We want to account for the geographic distribution by macro regions. That's in line with the ICH recommendations, that we should follow the burden of disease. But then we go into the countries. How do we select the countries in the macro regions? And here it's really a balance of some aspects of we want to be representative, but we want to make sure that also we will conduct our trials in places where eventually the drug will be registered, we'll have access, because there is a big ethical aspect of conducting trials, but then what happens when the trials are completed in terms of access to the drug? The last dimension of geography is really to see, once we are decided to involve, say, 15 countries in these trials, how do we select the sites? And again, how can we have an approach that will enable to have not only the traditional academic sites, but that we can actually reach out to where the patients are. The third principle is this design that I think shown very eloquently presented this morning. We want to have an end-to-end inclusive trial design. And I will show you some examples. There are two aspects. One is to have as much as we can. Not always we do have the data, but as much as we can, a data-driven approach to trial design. The second is to have involved the users. When we speak about the users, we speak about the patients, we speak about the investigators, the healthcare professionals. The next principle is we are lacking data. That's what we said. We are lacking data in social determinant of health, in social orientation, so we need to collect more data in our clinical trials. The way that we do it should be the way that people self-identify. And as we build, we will get an approach that's much better help us to analyze our data and then say, oh, given where we are in the development, this is what we know, this is what we miss, this is what we should continue then to generate evidence on. The last principle is how can we maximize once we have designed the trial, we've placed it, we've said we go in these sites, in these countries, how do we maximize then the ability for patients to actually participate, and what happens when the trial is over? So let me just now give you a couple of more examples of how we do that in practice. So for all the disease in which we have some products in development, we have a systematic collection of data and analysis of the available data on the biomarkers, the ancestries, the disparities. Of course, epidemiology is key, but also, do we have difference in diagnosis? It may be that there is an apparent difference in prevalence, but it may just be that some people are not diagnosed as early and that the underlying prevalence is not so different. What is the quality of care? Are there any differences by race, ethnicity, age, and sex? So we do this systematic collection, and we develop what we call internally these population analysis reports. When we do the study placement, I just described briefly that we go into these three subsequent steps, and again, we try to do as much as possible driven by data. What do we know from the previous performance of some sites, for example, looking at our data, but also at other sponsors, and seeing which centers have actually been able to deliver underlying a diverse population, and try to selectively then work with this one. There is now much more data available so that we can learn from the past experiences and accordingly place the trials adequately. This is an example of how we apply the first two principles, who are the patients and where, with multiple myeloma. So from the analytics of the population, we get very clear information that there are differences to account for in terms of the age distribution, in terms of the gender distribution, in terms of the racial aspect. We account for that. We also account for the distribution of the disease, not only from the prevalence. What we do usually is you compare what is the prevalence number of cases per 100,000. That gives you the density. Like if there are more cases per 100,000, like examples presented by Sean, you see that in this subgroup there are more risks to have the condition. But what really matters also is the absolute number, which is a mix of the underlying prevalence by 100,000 and the size of the population. If you are in a country of 500 million people, it's not the same as a country of 10 million people. And we need to make some trade-offs and balance these two aspects. The protocol design. Here, as I mentioned, there are two aspects, data-driven and user-informed. I just want to share that there are two now practices that we systematize in our company, which is that for protocol design, we've created something that is called Protocol Designer. It has actually 3 steps. The first is that when someone wants to create a new protocol, he can tap into a database of existing protocols in the same condition from Roche and from other available. And immediately they can be brought and you can compare thanks to AI, how the inclusion and exclusion criteria have been different and make some recommendations. That's first step. The second step, we have a systematic automated checking of the inclusion and exclusion criteria versus are they likely to have an impact on the ability to recruit a diverse population. That is flagged to the person who is creating a new protocol. What is not available but which is under development is then tapping into real-world data, electronic health record databases, so that when you create your protocol and you say, I put my HbA1c limit at X, giving the rest you can tap into underlying data to say, how much will that reduce my population? If I modify this criteria, how much will that increase? So that will then make it mandatory for any team that develop a protocol to have at least a data-driven approach and then to justify the choices that are made for inclusion-exclusion criteria. When we speak about the user-informed, it's again systematically having some consultation with patient representatives and with investigators about the feasibility, about the schedule of assessment, and so on. Again, another example, this is a breast cancer protocol. If you look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria that were modified, that was specifically different from the previous breast cancer trials that were done, just really based on, we know that these affect the ability of patients to join the study. In terms of the data collection, we have modified our case report form to be much more able to capture race, ethnicity, as they are described not only in the US, which was the initial what we were following the FDA, now we've modified it to be much more comprehensive in our ability to capture this. We also have developed a questionnaire to collect the social orientation and the gender identity. We've not applied that consistently. We have piloted it in some studies, and now we have to decide if we make that a standard requirement. Similarly, for the social determinant of health, we have developed an initial questionnaire. As you can see, this is the categories I think would apply overall, but the way that we word them, this is going to be different in different parts of the world. Again, something that we pilot, we test, and that we want to generalize in our approach. The last point is maximizing access to trials. As a principle, and this preceded any diversity effort, we have an ethical engagement that we will never run clinical trials in countries where we don't have a reasonable chance to bring our medicine. It has to be a regulatory pathway, a reasonable access pathway, otherwise we will not do trials there. Now, facilitating the trials, the key word is really partnership and trustworthiness. We have actually a catalog of services that now is standard that we actually put in the budget of any new clinical study and that we discuss with the sites. Do you need help and what is relevant for you? Pre-enrollment, during enrollment, after study completion. And that's really not imposing anything. Initially, we've tried, and we say, okay, this is available for everyone, and most of the sites we're not using. We discuss with them what would help you in your context around with your community to facilitate the enrollment of patients of different background. So in summary, we have this framework. The first three principles, they are more or less specific to every new development. They are data-driven based on the disease. The last two, what we collect and the measures that we can apply, we have a kind of generic set of approaches. And as you've seen, all what we do, this is really connected to other stakeholders. That's not the industry in isolation. We do everything really connected to patients representative or caregiver representative, interacting with scientists in order to design the protocol rightly. The role of policy and regulators is essential to basically help and move the needle. And people who are caring with patients are essential to have. When we talk about elderly, we need to have the people who are caring for the older patients and hear their voice. I just want to finish on one aspect, which is this trust building. This is not something that you do overnight. It's not when you want to introduce a study that suddenly you start talking to people. You're not credible if you do that. you need to actually build long-term commitments. One of the long-term things that we do is an initiative which is called Air Site Alliance. This is an alliance with some sites where we invest so that they can increase their own ability to reach out to a more diverse population. So it goes with some training, looking at their processes, and so on. And we have done that in a certain number of countries. It's not yet across the globe, but we have in Africa 4 countries where we have an Air Site Alliance. We have in India 10 public sites which we have developed and we're working hand in hand. We have some centers in the UK, in the US, and in Canada. Even more thinking about the broader picture, doing clinical trials is not sufficient. An example here is from Africa. Yes, we do more clinical trials in Africa than we've done in the past, but we are also involved in, eventually, if we don't understand the underlying genomic determinants of disease from Black patients, we will not be able to provide to them the appropriate treatments. We need to account for that. The genomic data that we have is primarily in white patients. We are heavily invested in the African Genomic Program, and I mentioned also very often it's an issue of patients not being diagnosed. So we also are partnering for some screening and diagnosis program, and then when we come with clinical trials, of course, then people understand that we are not just interested about running clinical trials efficiency or more diversity, it's really around understanding the population needs, the population science, and how we can help progress. So I finish here. For me, the call to action, we have it internally, but we have it collectively. We cannot, the industry, do things on our own. I can see that very many of the aspects that we are really pushing and really implementing, not just talking about it, are very connected to what I can see many speakers have advocated for. So this is really a fantastic opportunity to work together on that. Thank you very much.
There's time for one question. Okay, so there's time only for one question.
Thanks, thanks, Bruno. It was fab. I'm going to ask you a question about data. So when you talked about the data to inform the who, the first of your 5 principles, is that data from within Roche or external publicly available data or a combination?
Yeah, so it's a mix. So we have identified some of the, for example, epi sources that we believe are the most useful and the most reliable, like Global IHME or Globocan or USCS. That's one set. We have also internal data that are extremely interesting. We have developed what we call the CTDD, Clinical Trial Demographic Dashboards. We have analyzed, I think it's about 500 clinical trials over the last 10 years where we had started collecting demographic. It's not perfect, but we have age, race, ethnicity, countries, and sex. And we have that available. And we know what we've been doing and how this connects to the underlying distribution. So we use that as one of the data points. What we are using also is electronic health records. So some in the US are extremely useful. I think the challenge in Europe is that we don't have European electronic, so we need to get bits and pieces, but that's basically the 3 sources: EPI, internal data, and electronic health records.